Let's get started. Story number 1.
The town of Black Hollow was no stranger to harsh winters. Nestled deep in the valley, surrounded by snow-capped mountains and endless pine forests, it was the kind of place where nights stretched longer than days, and silence became a constant companion. For Jonah Carter, a retired forest ranger, the isolation was a comfort. After years of patrolling the wilderness, he'd chosen this solitude, living in a modest cabin miles from the nearest neighbor. He appreciated the stillness, the simplicity. But that winter night, something in the air felt wrong. It had started earlier in the evening. The wind howled louder than usual, rattling the windows in their frames. Jonah had shrugged it off as nothing more than the usual ferocity of a January storm. But then there was the knocking. At first it was soft, rhythmic, almost like the tapping of a branch against the cabin. Jonah ignored it, stirring the pot of stew simmering on the stove. Max, his old shepherd mix, growled low from his spot by the fire. "Relax, boy," Jonah muttered, patting the dog's head. But Max didn't settle. His ears were pinned back, his eyes fixed on the door. The knocking grew louder, insistent. Jonah felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. He grabbed the flashlight from the counter and opened the door. The wind bit at his face and snow swirled in the beam of light. There was no one there. No footprints in the fresh snow leading to the door. Just the vast, empty expanse of white stretching toward the dark tree line. Jonah shut the door quickly, bolting it. "Wind must have loosened something," he said aloud, more to comfort himself than anything. But Max's growling continued, his body tense and rigid. The power flickered once, twice, then died completely. The cabin was plunged into darkness, save for the glow of the fire. Jonah lit an oil lamp, the weak flame casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. Outside, the storm seemed to intensify, the wind screaming through the trees like a chorus of mournful voices. Then came the footsteps. They were faint at first, barely audible over the storm, but Jonah knew the sound well. Years of tracking through the forest had attuned his ears to the distinctive crunch of boots on snow. He grabbed his rifle from the corner and moved toward the window, careful to stay out of sight. Through the frosted glass, he could make out a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the cabin's weak light. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs too long and spindly. The figure didn't move, didn't sway in the wind like a person should. It simply stood there, watching. "Who's out there?" Jonah called, his voice firm, despite the knot of unease tightening in his chest. No response. He aimed the flashlight out the window, but the beam barely seemed to reach the figure. Jonah's heart pounded. He was a rational man, not prone to flights of fancy, but there was something about the way that figure stood, motionless against the storm, that made his stomach churn. The figure moved. It wasn't a step, not exactly. It was more like a glide, sudden and unnatural, covering several feet in an instant. It stopped closer to the cabin now, its form more distinct. Jonah's breath caught in his throat as he realized the figure's face, or lack of one. Where a face should have been, there was only smooth, pale skin, stretched tight like wax. Jonah stumbled back from the window, his pulse racing. Max barked furiously, his teeth bared as he faced the door. The knocking started again, louder this time, more frantic. It was coming from the back door now. Jonah moved quickly, the rifle heavy in his hands. He didn't want to open the door, but he also couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread building in his chest. When he reached the back door, the knocking stopped. He hesitated, then threw it open, aiming the rifle into the night. Nothing, just the storm and the endless snow. Jonah stepped back, his hands trembling. He locked the door and braced it with a chair, his mind racing. He didn't believe in ghosts, didn't believe in anything that couldn't be explained by logic or science. But this defied explanation. The whispers started next. At first, Jonah thought it was the wind, but the longer he listened, the more he realized the voices were distinct. They spoke in hushed tones, words he couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable, accusatory, angry. The fire dimmed, the shadows on the walls growing darker and more menacing. Jonah gripped the rifle tighter, his knuckles white. He felt a cold draft sweep through the cabin, though every window and door was shut tight. Then he saw it, a shadow moving across the far wall, its form twisted and grotesque. It wasn't his shadow, it wasn't Max's. It moved with a will of its own, stretching and contorting as it crept closer. "Get out of here," Jonah shouted, raising the rifle. He fired once, the sound deafening in the small cabin. The shadow dissipated, but only for a moment. It reappeared, this time larger, darker, spreading like ink across the walls. Max barked and lunged at the shadow, but his body froze mid-leap. He fell to the ground with a yelp, his legs stiff and unmoving. Jonah dropped to his knees, his hands shaking as he tried to rouse the dog. Max's eyes were wide with fear, his breaths shallow. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, a cacophony of voices that filled Jonah's head. He pressed his hands to his ears, but it didn't help. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in around him. And then he heard it. A single, clear voice cutting through the noise. "You should have left." The air grew impossibly cold. Frost crept across the floor, the windows, the walls. Jonah's breath came out in ragged, visible gasps. He tried to stand, but the weight of the air pressed down on him, forcing him to his knees. The front door creaked open, though Jonah hadn't touched it. Snow blew in, swirling around the cabin like a living thing. In the doorway stood the figure, its head cocked at an unnatural angle, its faceless visage staring straight at him. Jonah couldn't move. His body was frozen, his mind trapped in a haze of fear. The figure stepped inside, its long limbs folding unnaturally as it ducked through the doorway. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. The figure knelt before him, its face inches from his. Jonah wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to obey. The figure reached out, its hand cold and skeletal, and touched his chest. Pain. Searing, unimaginable pain shot through Jonah's body. It felt as though his very soul was being ripped apart. He gasped, his vision darkening, the world fading around him. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the figure's grotesque smile, stretching impossibly wide, filled with teeth that glistened like shards of ice. The next morning, the storm had passed. The sheriff found Jonah's cabin buried in snow, the door wide open. Inside, the fire had long since gone out, and frost covered every surface. They found Jonah slumped against the wall, his eyes wide open, frozen in a mask of terror. Max lay by his side, unmoving but untouched. There were no footprints leading to or from the cabin, no signs of anyone else having been there. The locals whispered about the Whispering Pines, about the things that lurked in the forest on winter nights. But the official report ruled Jonah's death as a heart attack, brought on by the cold. And yet, those who knew the forest, who understood its secrets, would say otherwise. Because on nights when the wind howled through the trees, some claimed you could still hear the knocking on Jonah's cabin door. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The snow whispered beneath Sarah's boots as she trudged along the narrow forest trail. The moonlight cast a silver sheen over the skeletal trees, their branches clawing at the sky. The air was still, so unnaturally quiet it seemed to press against her eardrums. It was the kind of cold that bit into the bones, yet Sarah had felt an inexplicable pull to venture out that winter night. She had rented a cabin deep in the woods for some solitude after a chaotic year. The rental description had promised peace, but as she reached the edge of a frozen lake, Sarah realized this wasn't peace, it was isolation. The nearest town was 20 miles away, and the single-lane road leading to the cabin was buried under the latest snowstorm. Sarah stopped by the lake, her breath curling in frosty tendrils. The surface of the ice glimmered under the pale moonlight, reflecting the forest around it like a black mirror. A strange sensation swept over her, a tingling at the back of her neck as if unseen eyes were fixed on her. She turned sharply, scanning the trees, but there was nothing, only shadows stretched long and ominous, playing tricks on her mind. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She fumbled it out, expecting no signal but still hopeful for a message. The screen displayed only one word, written in an app she didn't recognize. Run! Her heart stuttered. She stared at the screen, her gloved thumb trembling over the phone. Was it a prank? A virus? Before she could decide, the faintest sound drifted to her ears, a soft crunch of snow from somewhere behind her. Hello, she called, her voice cracking in the still air. The sound was swallowed by the trees, leaving behind only silence. But it wasn't empty silence. It was weighted, expectant, like the forest was holding its breath. Sarah began to back away from the lake, her boots crunching louder in her own ears. She dared not turn her back to the trees, her eyes darting from one shadow to the next. The moonlight shifted slightly as clouds began to crawl across the sky, dimming her view. She fumbled with her flashlight, its beam weak and flickering. A sense of dread clawed at her chest. The sound came again, closer this time. A deliberate step. It was no animal. The weight of it was human. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice rising. Her flashlight swept the trees, the beam catching on a figure that shouldn't have been there. It was a man, or the shape of one. He stood motionless between the trees, his face obscured by the hood of a dark coat. Sarah's breath hitched as she noticed the snow beneath him was undisturbed, as if he hadn't walked to that spot. The figure tilted its head slightly, unnervingly, like a predator sizing up prey. Her phone buzzed again. She didn't dare look away from the figure as she lifted it. The same app flashed another message. "Don't look away." Her pulse roared in her ears. This was no prank. Sarah's flashlight flickered, its beam dimming further until it sputtered out entirely. Panic surged as darkness closed in. She fumbled for the backup battery in her coat pocket, but her numb fingers betrayed her. The battery slipped and vanished into the snow. The figure began to move, slow and deliberate. His steps made no sound, though his form grew closer. Sarah stumbled backward, her breath coming in short gasps that formed icy clouds. The forest around her seemed alive now, branches creaking, the wind whispering like voices, and then the man stopped again, just before the edge of the frozen lake. Sarah's phone buzzed one final time. Her trembling hands barely held it steady as she glanced at the screen. "Look up!" Against her better judgment, she did. Her gaze traveled from the figure to the treetops above him, where something large and unnatural shifted. A mass of shadows writhed in the canopy, impossibly high and yet terrifyingly close. Eyes, hundreds of them, glimmered like pinpricks of light, watching her from the darkness. The figure by the lake raised a hand, pointing at her. The shadows surged downward like a living tide, tendrils of black mist spiraling toward her. Sarah screamed and bolted, running blindly into the forest. Branches tore at her jacket and snagged her hair, but she didn't stop. Her lungs burned as she ran, her mind screaming for her to wake up from what felt like a nightmare. But the cold biting at her cheeks and the sound of those shadows chasing her was too real. She tripped and fell hard into the snow, the icy impact knocking the air from her lungs. She twisted onto her back, expecting to see the shadows upon her, but they weren't. They had stopped at the edge of the tree line, swirling and writhing as if held back by some invisible force. The hooded figure stood among them, his face still hidden, but now she could hear a voice, a low murmur like a chant, indecipherable yet resonant with malice. The ground beneath her trembled. The lake groaned, its ice cracking like thunder. Sarah forced herself to her feet, stumbling toward the distant glow of her cabin's porch light. She didn't look back, too terrified of what she might see. When she finally burst through the cabin door, she slammed it shut and bolted it, her chest heaving. She grabbed the nearest chair and wedged it under the handle for good measure. Her heart pounded as she leaned against the door, her ears straining for any sound outside. The silence returned, oppressive and suffocating. Sarah moved to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. The forest was still, the lake distant and dark. The porch light flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging the cabin into darkness. Her phone buzzed in her hand. A single message glowed on the screen. "You can't hide." The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Sarah sank to the floor, clutching her knees as tears streamed down her face. The shadows had found her, and she realized with a sinking dread that they weren't just outside anymore. They were inside. The cabin grew colder, the air heavy with the scent of decay. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, creeping toward her like grasping fingers. Sarah's screams echoed into the night, swallowed by the winter's endless silence. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The snow had started falling just before dusk, a slow drift of powder that coated the sleepy town of Willow Creek in a ghostly white blanket. By nightfall, the storm had transformed into a raging blizzard, the kind that trapped people indoors and turned roads into death traps. It was the kind of night where nothing stirred, except perhaps things better left undisturbed. Claire Sanderson had driven up to her family's old cabin that morning, planning to spend a quiet weekend alone. The cabin, perched on the edge of Blackwood Forest, had been her late father's favorite retreat. Though she hadn't been there in years, she felt an unshakable pull to visit, an inexplicable urge that gnawed at her until she finally gave in. She didn't question it too much. Lately, life had felt heavy, weighed down by grief and memories. A weekend in the quiet wilderness sounded like just what she needed. The cabin was small and unassuming, with weathered wood siding and a single stone chimney that puffed out a thin trail of smoke into the frozen air. Inside, it was simple. A worn couch, a kitchenette, and a wood stove that radiated just enough warmth to keep the chill at bay. Claire lit a few oil lamps when the power flickered out around 8 p.m., and their soft glow filled the space with an almost comforting warmth. Almost. The first strange thing happened around 9 p.m. Claire was seated on the couch, bundled in a thick blanket, sipping tea and reading a book. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, battering the cabin with ferocious gusts. Max, her orange tabby, was curled up at her side, his ears twitching occasionally at the sounds outside. Then came the noise. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind, a rhythmic crunching sound like boots on snow slowly circling the cabin. Claire froze, her heart skipping a beat. She strained to listen, her mind racing. It wasn't uncommon for wildlife to wander close, but this was different. The sound was deliberate, methodical. Crunch, crunch, crunch. She stood, her pulse thudding in her ears. Grabbing the flashlight from the counter, she moved toward the front window, careful not to let her shadow fall across the curtains. She pulled them back just a fraction, enough to peer outside. Nothing. The beam of her flashlight cut through the swirling snow, but revealed only the empty clearing surrounding the cabin. The crunching stopped. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaky. "Is someone there?" The wind howled in response. She closed the curtains quickly, her chest tight with unease. Telling herself it was just her imagination, she returned to the couch. Max was now sitting upright, his eyes fixed on the window, his tail twitching. "You heard it too, huh?" she murmured, scratching behind his ears, but Max didn't respond the way he usually did. He jumped down and padded toward the door, his fur bristling. Claire followed cautiously, the flashlight still in hand. She pressed her ear to the door and listened. At first, there was nothing. Then, knock, knock, knock. 3 sharp raps, loud and insistent. She jumped back, her heart slamming against her ribs. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer. Knock, knock, knock. This time, it came from the side window. Claire spun around, the flashlight shaking in her grip. She pointed it toward the window, but the curtains were drawn. She could only see the faint outline of frost spreading across the glass. Her breath came in shallow gasps. "It's just the wind," she whispered, trying to convince herself. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The knocking moved again, now to the back door. Max hissed, his tail puffing up like a bottle brush. Claire's hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the flashlight. The storm outside was too fierce for someone to be playing pranks, and even if it was an animal, why would it knock? "Stay calm," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Gripping the flashlight tightly, she approached the back door. The knocking stopped as she neared. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Slowly, she unlocked it and opened the door just a crack. The night was a wall of white. Snow swirled furiously in the wind, erasing any sign of tracks or movement. But there was something else. A sensation. A weight in the air, thick and oppressive, pressing down on her chest. "Hello?" she called again, her voice nearly swallowed by the storm. Nothing. She slammed the door shut and locked it, her fingers fumbling with the bolt. Max yowled from the living room, drawing her attention. She turned to see him staring at the fireplace, his body low to the ground, ears flat against his skull. "What's wrong, buddy?" she asked, her voice quivering. The fire flickered, the flames dimming for just a moment before roaring back to life. In that brief instant, Claire saw it, an outline in the shadows, tall and unmoving, standing just at the edge of the room. She screamed and spun around, aiming the flashlight wildly. The beam illuminated the empty room. Nothing was there, but the feeling remained. That suffocating weight, as if something unseen was watching her, closing in. She grabbed Max and backed toward the center of the room. Her mind raced, searching for logical explanations, but none came. She had never believed in ghosts, never entertained the idea of the supernatural. But what else could this be? The whispers started next. Soft at first, like the murmur of wind through the trees, but they grew louder, distinct, and all around her. It wasn't the wind, it was voices. Dozens of them, overlapping, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. "Leave," one voice hissed, cutting through the others like a blade. Claire's knees buckled. She sank to the floor, clutching Max tightly as the whispers swirled around her. The air grew colder, frost creeping across the windows and walls. The fire dimmed again, this time not returning to full strength. And then it stopped. The whispers, the cold, the oppressive weight, all of it vanished in an instant. The room was still. Claire's heart hammered in her chest as she struggled to catch her breath. She didn't dare move, didn't dare speak. For several minutes, she sat there in silence, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Finally, she rose to her feet, still clutching the flashlight. Max followed close behind, his tail low, his eyes darting nervously. She decided then and there she couldn't stay. Whatever was happening, she needed to leave, storm or no storm. She gathered her coat and boots, threw them on, and grabbed her car keys. The snow was deep, but if she could make it to the main road, she'd be safe. She opened the front door, stepping into the howling wind. The clearing was empty, just as before. But as she trudged toward her car, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Footprints. They weren't hers. They were large, impossibly so, and they didn't follow a natural gait. Instead, they appeared in pairs, spaced far apart, as if something had been leaping from place to place. They circled the cabin and led straight to the car. Claire hesitated, her breath clouding in the frigid air. She felt the weight again, that oppressive presence pressing down on her chest. Slowly, she turned her flashlight toward the tree line. There it was, a figure, tall and impossibly thin, its body obscured by the storm. It didn't move, didn't flinch, but she could feel its gaze locked on her. Its head tilted unnaturally, slaw as if curious, and then it took a step forward. Claire didn't wait. She ran to the car, fumbling with the keys as her hands shook. The figure moved closer, gliding across the snow with an unnatural speed. She jumped into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. The headlights illuminated the figure fully now. It had no face, just smooth, pale skin stretched tight over its head. Its arms were too long, its fingers ending in jagged claws that glinted in the light. It raised one hand, pressing it against the windshield, and leaned in close. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling the car. Claire screamed, slamming the car into reverse. The tires spun against the snow, but she didn't stop. The figure didn't chase her. It simply stood there, watching, as she disappeared into the night. The next day, Claire returned with the sheriff and a few neighbors, her hands still trembling as she told them what had happened. They found the cabin just as she'd left it, the doors locked and the fire out. But the footprints were still there, impossibly large and circling the property. No one could explain it, and no one wanted to stay long enough to try. Claire never went back to the cabin. She sold it a month later, wanting nothing more than to forget that winter night. But sometimes, when the wind howled outside her apartment, she swore she could still hear the whispers, faint and distant, calling her back. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The wind howled through the skeletal branches of the pine trees, their darkened silhouettes shivering against the pale glow of the full moon. Thick snow blanketed the forest, its pristine surface untouched save for a narrow trail leading to a forgotten cabin nestled deep in the woods. For years, no one had dared venture near the place, not since the tragedy decades ago. Naomi tightened her scarf against her neck as the cold bit at her skin. She had heard the stories, of course, whispers in her small town about the winter ghosts that haunted these woods. But she didn't believe in ghosts, not really. She was a rational woman, someone who preferred the facts over superstition. So when she inherited her late uncle's cabin, she decided to spend the weekend there, determined to prove to herself and everyone else that there was nothing to fear. Her boots crunched against the icy ground as she trudged toward the cabin. The structure loomed ahead, its sagging roof and frosted windows giving it an air of desolation. She pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The air was cold, colder than it had been outside, and the faint scent of pine and decay lingered in the shadows. Setting her bag down, Naomi lit the lantern she'd brought, the warm glow pushing back the darkness. The cabin was modest, just one large room with a fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a cot in the corner. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs draped the beams like a tattered veil. Naomi set about making the place livable. She dusted off the cot, laid out her sleeping bag, and stacked firewood in the hearth. Once a small fire crackled to life, the warmth began to seep into the room. She made herself some tea, sipping it as she gazed out the frost-covered window. The forest was eerily silent, the stillness pressing against the glass like a living thing. As the hours passed, Naomi tried to focus on her book, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She told herself it was just her imagination, stirred up by the ghost stories she'd overheard. Still, the weight of the silence gnawed at her nerves. It wasn't until late that night, when she finally lay down to sleep, that the first strange thing happened. She woke suddenly, her breath misting in the freezing air. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the room. At first, she thought it was the cold that had woken her, but then she heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the wall. Naomi sat up, her heart pounding. "Just a mouse," she muttered to herself. She grabbed the lantern and approached the wall. The sound stopped. She waited, holding her breath, but there was only silence. Shrugging it off, she returned to bed. But no sooner had she closed her eyes than the noise started again, this time louder, more insistent. It was as if something was clawing at the wood, desperate to get inside. "Enough," Naomi said aloud, her voice trembling slightly. She grabbed a flashlight and scanned the walls, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. Nothing. No signs of rodents, no holes, nothing out of the ordinary. But as she turned back toward the cot, she froze. The condensation on the window, which had been blank and foggy earlier, now bore the imprint of a hand. The fingers were long and spindly, pressed so hard against the glass that frost had formed around the edges. Naomi's blood turned to ice. She stepped closer, her breath hitching. The handprint was on the inside of the glass. She spun around, scanning the room, but she was alone, or so she thought. That's when she saw it, just a fleeting shadow in the corner of her eye, disappearing into the far corner of the room. The fire flared suddenly, casting wild, dancing shapes on the walls. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice shaking. There was no answer, only the sound of the wind outside, keening like a mournful wail. The next few hours were a blur of terror. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, moving from the walls to the floor beneath her feet. The fire kept flaring and dying, as though something unseen was tampering with it. And always, there was that sense of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the edge of the lantern's light. At one point, Naomi thought she heard whispers, faint and unintelligible, but undeniably real. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, circling her like a predator closing in on its prey. By dawn, she was huddled in the corner, clutching the lantern like a lifeline. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She hadn't slept. She hadn't dared. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, she decided she couldn't stay another night. Packing her things in a frenzy, Naomi prepared to leave. But as she opened the door, she stopped cold. There, in the fresh snow leading up to the cabin, were footprints. They were impossibly large, far larger than any human foot, and they led from the woods to her door, but not away from it. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Whatever had made those prints was still inside. She didn't stop to think. She grabbed her bag and bolted, running down the trail as fast as her legs would carry her. The forest seemed darker than it had the day before, the shadows deeper, more menacing. The whispers followed her, growing louder with each step, until they were a deafening roar in her ears. When she finally emerged from the woods, she collapsed onto the icy road, gasping for breath. A passing driver found her and took her back to town. Naomi never spoke of what happened that night, not to the driver, not to her friends, not to anyone. But she sold the cabin the very next day, refusing to set foot in those woods ever again. They say the cabin still stands, a lonely relic in the heart of the forest, and on winter nights when the wind is just right, you can hear the scratching, the whispers, the sound of something that was never meant to leave the dark. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The snowstorm came in waves, thick and fast, with little warning. By the time Lucy arrived at her family's old cabin, the road had already been swallowed by drifts, and visibility was down to just a few feet. She pulled her collar up against the biting wind, knowing she had no choice but to continue on foot. It wasn't far, just a half mile, but in the storm, it felt like an eternity. She had driven up from the city to spend a quiet weekend alone. Her parents had passed years ago, and the cabin, a place filled with childhood memories, had been left to her. She'd always planned to return, but life, work, relationships had kept her away. Now, after a long time, she felt the need to reconnect with the place. By the time she reached the cabin, her hands were frozen, and her cheeks were flushed a deep red from the cold. She opened the heavy wooden door and stepped into the warmth of the small, rustic interior. The fireplace crackled, the only sound besides the winds howling outside. The smell of aged wood and pine greeted her, and she smiled at the familiar sight of the room, a mixture of old furniture, photographs, and the remnants of her parents' lives. Lucy set her things down and went to start the fire. The wood was damp from the storm, and the flames struggled at first, but soon the cabin was filled with warmth. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat down by the fire, feeling a strange sense of peace wash over her. That peace was short-lived. She had just begun to relax when she heard it, a faint scratching sound. At first, she thought it was the wind, the way it sometimes rattled the old house, but then it came again, closer this time. It sounded like nails against wood, deliberate and steady. She froze, her hands still holding the wine glass, but it was only a moment before she convinced herself it was just the house settling. The storm had been fierce, and the weather always made the cabin creak, but the scratching continued. Lucy's heart began to pound. She set the wine glass down, her breath shallow as she stood up. The sound seemed to come from the walls, maybe the ceiling. She walked cautiously toward the corner, her mind racing through explanations. Maybe it was a rodent, or perhaps the trees scraping against the roof. But deep down, she knew something felt off. As she approached the wall, the scratching stopped. The sudden silence felt oppressive, and Lucy shivered, even though the room was warm. She slowly backed away from the corner, her eyes scanning the dimly lit room. The fire flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped. Lucy's breath came out in visible puffs despite the fire burning brightly. She turned to the fireplace, but the flames were still strong, still crackling. It was then that she saw it. A figure. A shadow, darker than the rest of the room, standing by the door. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The shadow stood there, unmoving, silent, as if it were waiting for her to notice. Lucy blinked, and it was gone. Just like that. But the silence remained, thick and oppressive. Her skin crawled as she tried to make sense of what she had just seen. She knew she hadn't imagined it. Something was in the cabin with her. Trying to shake off the fear, she hurried to the door, planning to go outside and check the surroundings. Maybe confirm it was just a trick of the light or the storm playing tricks on her mind. But when she opened the door, the storm greeted her, fiercer than before. She stepped outside, the cold immediately biting into her skin. The wind howled in her ears, and the snow whipped around her in a blinding blur. She called out, but her voice was swallowed by the storm. Nothing was there. The woods were as empty as they had been when she arrived. Lucy stood there for a moment, uncertain, but then she closed the door behind her, the unsettling feeling growing stronger. When she turned back to the fire, she saw that the shadows in the room had deepened, the corners stretching farther than before. She tried to tell herself it was nothing, just the house, just the storm. But the feeling that something wasn't right gnawed at her. She went to the kitchen to make tea, trying to calm her nerves, but as the kettle whistled and she poured the hot water into a cup, the sound returned. The scratching. It was louder now, coming from above her. She froze, the tea spilling over the side of the cup as she looked up, her throat tight with fear. There was no logical explanation for it. No mice, no rats. The house was old, but it wasn't falling apart. And yet, the sound was undeniable. She tried to shake it off, but the fear was overwhelming. The scratching continued, and as the minutes passed, it seemed to grow louder, more frantic, as though something or someone was trying to break through. Finally, Lucy couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and moved toward the staircase. The steps creaked under her weight as she ascended to the second floor. The cold grew more intense with each step, and the wind's howling grew distant, as if it were coming from somewhere else entirely. At the top of the stairs, she froze. There, at the end of the hall, stood the figure again, just beyond the threshold of the bedroom door. She couldn't make out any details, but the shape was tall and thin, its form cloaked in shadows. This time, she couldn't deny what she was seeing. It was real, and it was in her house. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay calm. The figure didn't respond. It only stood still, its outline flickering like a candle's flame. Lucy took a step forward, and the figure did the same, matching her movements, moving as if it were tethered to her. The temperature dropped even further. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and the hairs on her neck stood on end. The scratching noise was back, louder than before, now seeming to come from within the walls themselves. The figure moved closer, its shape becoming clearer. It was gaunt, unnaturally thin, with hollow eyes and a gaping mouth. Lucy's heart slammed against her chest as it took another step toward her. Suddenly, the door to the bedroom slammed open with a deafening crash. The figure froze, and a gust of cold air filled the hallway, sending Lucy stumbling back in shock. That was enough. Lucy didn't need any more confirmation. She turned and ran, her footsteps pounding down the hall, down the stairs, and back into the living room. But as she reached the door, she hesitated, looking back at the room she had been so eager to return to. A faint whisper floated to her ears, low and guttural. "Don't leave." Her hand was on the door handle when the whisper came again, louder this time, almost like a growl. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Without another thought, she flung the door open and bolted into the storm, the wind stinging her face. The cabin was behind her now, but the figure's presence lingered in the back of her mind. It wasn't just a ghost, it was a warning. The snowstorm raged on as she ran down the road, the cold creeping into her bones. She didn't stop until she reached the nearest town and found a place to stay the night. In the weeks that followed, Lucy returned to the cabin. It was her family's home, after all. But the storm had claimed the road, and no matter how many times she tried to get back, the path was always blocked, as though the house itself were guarding its secrets. And the scratching? It never stopped, not for a moment. Every winter night the sound was there, just beyond the walls. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The blizzard had been raging for hours. Heavy snow piled up against the windows, muffling the world in a cold, white silence. Samantha Parker sat huddled on the couch of her family's old hunting cabin, wrapped in a thick quilt and nursing a mug of hot cocoa. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, rattling the shutters and bending the trees. The cabin, deep in the wilderness of northern Maine, was supposed to be a peaceful getaway. Samantha had come here to escape the noise of her city life, the endless responsibilities, and the heartbreak of a recent breakup. Her father's cabin had always been her sanctuary, but tonight it felt different. The isolation, which she usually found comforting, felt oppressive, as if the storm had brought something darker with it. The electricity had gone out an hour ago, forcing her to rely on the fire and a few oil lamps for light. Shadows danced on the log walls, stretching and shrinking in eerie patterns. Samantha tried to focus on her book, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. It started with a sound, a soft but deliberate tapping at the window. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The cabin was surrounded by dense woods, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. The wind? She dismissed the thought almost immediately. The taps were too rhythmic, too deliberate to be random. Setting the mug down, Samantha grabbed the flashlight from the side table and stood, her heart pounding in her chest. She approached the window slowly, her socked feet silent on the wooden floor. The tapping stopped as she reached the pane, and when she pulled the curtain aside, all she saw was the storm. A swirling mass of snow and darkness. "Hello?" she called hesitantly, her voice barely audible over the wind. No response. Shaking her head, she pulled the curtain closed and scolded herself for being jumpy. It was probably a branch swaying in the wind, she told herself. She returned to the couch, but the unease lingered. Minutes passed in uneasy silence before she heard it again. Tap, 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 tap. This time it came from the back door. Her body tensed. Gripping the flashlight tightly, she moved toward the door, every instinct screaming at her to stop. She peered through the peephole, but the swirling snow made it impossible to see anything. Taking a deep breath, she unlocked the door and opened it a crack, letting the cold rush in. No one was there. The porch was empty, and the fresh snow was undisturbed. Her breath fogged in the freezing air as she leaned out, shining the flashlight toward the edge of the clearing. Nothing but the dark woods beyond. "Is someone out there?" she called, louder this time. The only answer was the relentless howl of the wind. She shut the door quickly, bolting it. Her hands trembled as she stepped back. This wasn't her imagination. Something was out there, or someone. The minutes crawled by and Samantha stayed rooted to the spot, staring at the door. She thought about calling for help, but her phone had no signal out here. The landline in the cabin hadn't worked in years. She was utterly alone. Then she heard it, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps in the snow. They circled the cabin slowly, deliberately. Her heart raced as she tracked the sound, her eyes darting toward the windows. Who would be out in a storm like this? And why? The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Then the tapping resumed, this time at the front window. Samantha's pulse thundered in her ears as she crept toward the window. She pulled the curtain back ever so slightly, her flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. A face stared back at her. She screamed, stumbling back and dropping the flashlight. The face had been pale, almost translucent, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. It was there for only a second before vanishing into the storm. Heart pounding, Samantha grabbed the flashlight and shone it frantically toward the window. Nothing. No face, no figure, no footprints in the snow. But she knew what she had seen. Tears pricked her eyes as she backed away from the window, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "This isn't real," she whispered to herself. "It's just your imagination. You're tired, you're scared, that's all." But deep down, she knew it wasn't true. The fire sputtered and the room grew colder. Samantha threw another log onto the flames, but the chill persisted, seeping into her bones. She glanced toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. The shadows there seemed darker, deeper, as if something was lurking just out of sight. A soft creak echoed through the cabin. It came from the hallway. "No," she whispered, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. "No, no, no." The creak came again, closer this time. Samantha backed toward the couch, her eyes fixed on the hallway. Her flashlight flickered, the beam weakening. She shook it frantically, trying to coax it back to life. The fire dimmed further, the room plunging into near darkness. And then she saw it. A figure stood at the end of the hallway, tall and gaunt, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Its skin was pale, almost gray, and its eyes were black voids. It didn't move, didn't breathe. It just stood there, watching her. Samantha's throat tightened. She couldn't scream, couldn't move. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being dragged by invisible strings. The shadows seemed to stretch and writhe around it, reaching toward her. The flashlight died completely, leaving her in darkness. "No," she cried, scrambling toward the fireplace. The flames flared briefly as if in response, casting the room in a flickering orange glow. The figure was gone, but the feeling remained, the heavy, suffocating presence, the sense of being watched. Samantha's breath came in shallow gasps as she backed into the corner, clutching the quilt like it could protect her. The whispers started then, soft at first, barely audible over the wind, but they grew louder, a chorus of voices speaking in a language she didn't understand. They came from everywhere and nowhere, filling the cabin with a chilling, otherworldly sound. "Please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Please leave me alone." The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving a silence more terrifying than the noise. For a moment, Samantha thought it was over. But then she heard it, a single voice, clear and cold. "You shouldn't have come back." The fire went out. Darkness swallowed the room, and the cold became unbearable. Samantha felt a hand on her shoulder, icy and firm. She screamed, spinning around, but there was nothing there. The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her was the pale face, inches from her own, its hollow eyes staring into hers. When the storm cleared the next morning, a search party found the cabin. They had been called by Samantha's mother, who grew worried when she didn't check in. The cabin was empty. The fire was cold, the doors locked from the inside. Samantha's footprints were the only ones leading to the cabin, and there was no sign of her anywhere. But the searchers spoke of something else, something they couldn't explain. The snow around the cabin was undisturbed, except for a strange pattern of footprints circling the property. They were large and spaced too far apart to belong to any human. And when the search leader looked into the frosted window, he swore he saw a face staring back at him, a pale, hollow-eyed figure that disappeared the moment he blinked. Samantha was never found. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The blizzard had come out of nowhere. 1 minute, the sky was clear, the sun hanging lazily in the late afternoon sky. By the time Sarah had finished unpacking her car at the old family cabin, the wind had begun to pick up, howling like a wounded animal. Snow began to fall in thick, heavy sheets, blanketing the forest in a matter of minutes. She cursed under her breath and hurried to gather the last of her things, trying to ignore the growing unease creeping up her spine. The cabin was small and remote, nestled deep in the woods outside of town. It had been her grandparents' place, and after their passing, her parents had kept it. When they too had passed, Sarah inherited it. She'd never spent much time here, only occasional visits as a child, before the property became too much of a burden for her parents to keep up. Now, with her life in the city feeling more and more suffocating, Sarah thought the isolation might be exactly what she needed. But tonight, something felt off. The wind rattled the windows, and the snow seemed to howl outside in an eerie, unrelenting fury. She lit the fire in the hearth and unpacked the necessities: a blanket, some canned food, a bottle of wine. She had no plans to leave the cabin for the next 2 days. She was alone, and that was exactly what she wanted. It was getting late when she settled into the old armchair by the fire, the only light in the room flickering from the flames. The warmth of the fire felt comforting, but she couldn't shake the odd sensation that something was wrong. She looked over at the clock. It was only 9:30, but it felt much later. She told herself it was just the storm playing tricks on her mind, that the isolation was making her nervous. Yet, as she tried to relax, she couldn't ignore the growing feeling that she wasn't alone in the cabin. The wind continued to howl, but now there was another sound, faint like the creak of wood. Sarah froze, listening intently. The creaking came again, this time louder, like something was shifting upstairs. Her heart began to beat faster. It was an old house, of course. It was bound to make noises. Still, the sound was oddly rhythmic, as though someone were pacing back and forth. She stood up, forcing herself to move toward the staircase. The wood groaned beneath her feet, and the wind outside picked up again, louder now. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she hesitated. The upstairs was dark, the only light coming from the flickering flames in the hearth below. She gripped the railing, trying to steady her shaking hands. The sound above had stopped. Maybe it was just the storm, maybe the house was settling. But then she heard it again, a faint whisper, barely audible over the wind. Sarah. Her breath caught in her throat. No one knew she was here. She had kept her trip to the cabin a secret, wanting to avoid any interruptions. Her mind raced. It had to be her imagination. But the whisper came again, clearer this time. Sarah? It was unmistakable. Someone was upstairs. Without thinking, she bolted back down the stairs and grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer. The cold metal handle was a comfort. As she gripped it tightly, the beam of light cutting through the darkness of the cabin. She moved cautiously, each step slow and deliberate, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispering was gone now, replaced by the steady rhythm of her own breath and the wind outside that howled like a wolf. She stood at the foot of the stairs for a long moment, trying to steady herself. Everything in her told her to leave, to run from the cabin and never come back. But she couldn't. It was too late for that now. She had to know what was upstairs. With the flashlight in hand, she ascended the stairs slowly, the creaking of the old wood under her feet, the only sound in the house. As she reached the top of the stairs, she hesitated again. The hallway stretched out before her, its darkness palpable, as if it were a living thing. The door to her grandparents' bedroom stood at the end of the hall, slightly ajar. The air felt heavier here, as though it had been thickened by years of silence. She took another step forward, her pulse pounding in her ears, and as she neared the bedroom door, she froze. A figure stood in the doorway. It was tall, too thin. Its form was cloaked in shadow, almost blending into the darkness of the hallway. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The figure did not move, but she could feel its presence, as though it was watching her, waiting for her to make a move. The air around her grew colder, and she could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Her heart slammed against her ribs, and her legs refused to move. Then, without thinking, she stumbled backward, the flashlight falling from her hand and rolling across the floor. The beam of light flickered and died. The figure didn't move. The wind outside seemed to howl louder, but in that moment it felt like the entire world had gone silent. Sarah's mind raced, searching for an explanation, but there was none. The figure didn't belong here. It couldn't. Her grandparents had passed years ago, and there was no one else around. No one could have gotten in. But there it stood, a looming shadow, blocking the only exit. A low whisper came from the dark figure, its voice sounding like it was coming from all directions at once. "Leave. Now." Sarah couldn't move. She couldn't speak. Her entire body was frozen in terror, her mind trying to process what was happening, but it felt as if the walls of the house were closing in on her. Then, without warning, the figure took a step toward her. Everything inside Sarah screamed to run, but her legs wouldn't respond. She stumbled back, almost tripping over the loose floorboards, and the figure followed, its movements slow but deliberate. "Sarah, leave," it repeated, its voice growing louder. It felt like an eternity, but finally she snapped back to herself. Without thinking, she turned and bolted down the stairs, nearly falling as she raced through the living room and out the front door. The storm whipped around her, the wind stinging her face, but she didn't care. She ran. She ran until she reached her car, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the keys, finally managing to start the engine. The tires screeched as she sped away, her heart racing as the cabin disappeared into the darkness behind her. The storm raged on, but she didn't look back. Sarah never went back to the cabin. It stood there silent and empty, a relic of a past she was too afraid to confront, and the whispers never stopped. Story, the end.
Story number 8.
The wind had picked up by the time Lily arrived at the old farmhouse. It was a place she had visited many times as a child when her grandparents were still alive. Now, with her grandmother having passed away and the house empty, Lily had come back to check on it. It was supposed to be a quick trip, just a couple of days to make sure everything was in order before putting the house up for sale. But when she arrived, something felt off. The farmhouse sat at the edge of a thick, dark forest, isolated from the nearest town by miles of winding dirt roads. It was beautiful in its own way, but the kind of beauty that always had an underlying sense of eeriness. The house was large, with wide windows and a wraparound porch, but it had aged and weathered in the most peculiar way. Its once white paint had peeled, revealing gray wood beneath, and the roof had begun to sag in places. Despite the decay, Lily had always loved it, and some part of her had hoped the memories of her grandparents would make this visit feel like home. But as the snow began to fall, the warmth and comfort she had expected never arrived. Instead, the cold crept deeper into her bones, and a growing sense of unease settled over her. The first night, after unpacking her things, Lily settled in by the fireplace with a good book and a cup of tea. Outside, the wind howled and the snow whipped around the house. The old house creaked and groaned as if it were alive, shifting with the pressure of the storm. Lily tried to ignore the sounds, but they were impossible to block out. It was then that she heard it, a soft tapping sound coming from the window. Lily froze, her heart skipping a beat. The wind outside had picked up significantly, and it was hard to imagine anything that could be making such a noise in the middle of a snowstorm. But the tapping continued, slow, deliberate, like someone was tapping on the glass with a fingernail. With trembling hands, she set her book aside and got up to investigate. She pulled the heavy curtain aside and glanced out into the swirling snow. For a brief moment, there was nothing. The night was dark, and the wind had blotted out any view of the yard. But then her eyes caught something, a figure standing just beyond the reach of the porch light. It was too blurry to make out, but it was tall and thin, draped in dark clothing. Lily's breath caught in her throat. She squinted, trying to make sense of what she was seeing, but the figure remained motionless, as if watching her. Her instincts screamed for her to lock the window and turn away, but she couldn't. Instead, she stared back at the figure, feeling her heart race with a mix of fear and curiosity. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the storm. Her mind raced as she backed away from the window, her pulse pounding in her ears. It must have been someone from the nearby farm, she reasoned. Maybe a neighbor checking on her. But why hadn't they knocked at the door? Why hadn't they called out? The more she thought about it, the more the logic slipped away, leaving only the deep discomfort of being alone in a dark, cold house on a stormy night. The tapping stopped, but the unease remained. Lily returned to her seat by the fire, trying to distract herself with the book, but it was no use. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind made her jump. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, and despite the fire burning steadily, she pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders. She tried to sleep, but the house didn't want her to. The next day, the storm had not let up, and Lily spent most of the morning sorting through her grandmother's belongings. The house was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your skin and stayed there. Every room felt heavy with a strange, oppressive energy, the kind of energy that made you want to leave, but also made you afraid to move. Around noon, she heard a sound coming from upstairs. It was soft at first, but unmistakable. Footsteps. Lily's blood ran cold as she stood at the foot of the stairs, straining to hear. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, as if someone were walking through the hall, taking their time, unaware of her presence. The noise wasn't like the house settling. It was too rhythmic, too purposeful. "Grandma?" Lily called, her voice shaking as she tried to convince herself it was just the wind or some creak of the old house. But no, the footsteps continued, now closer, coming down the stairs. Lily stood frozen, her breath shallow as she slowly turned toward the kitchen, trying to make sense of what was happening. Maybe the wind had blown something upstairs, or maybe... Then she saw it. A shadow flickered across the hallway, just at the edge of her vision. It moved quickly, disappearing around the corner of the kitchen. For a moment, Lily didn't move. Her body felt numb with fear, but then she forced herself to walk toward the kitchen, each step heavy and slow. She stepped into the doorway and stopped. The kitchen was empty. But there, on the floor near the pantry, was a small object. It was a wooden carving, something her grandmother had kept in that spot for years. Lily recognized it instantly, but what she didn't understand was how it had ended up on the floor, far from its usual place. Her grandmother had always kept that carving in the same spot, a little wooden figure of a woman holding a basket. It had never been moved, at least not since Lily could remember. But now it was on the floor, as though it had been knocked over by some invisible hand. Lily bent down, her fingers brushing the carving. It was ice cold, despite the warmth of the house. Her heart thudded in her chest as she reached for it, her eyes flicking nervously toward the dark hallway. Something was wrong. She could feel it. A sudden, sharp bang echoed from upstairs, making her jump back. The sound of something falling, crashing to the floor. Lily's blood ran cold as she rushed toward the stairs. The house felt as though it was alive, breathing in time with her racing heart. She reached the top of the stairs and hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. She could hear the wind howling outside, but it was something else that caught her attention. Whispers. Quiet, barely audible whispers, coming from the direction of her grandmother's bedroom. She moved toward the door, pushing it open with shaking hands. Inside, the room was just as she remembered it. Simple, with a large four-poster bed and an old rocking chair by the window. But something was wrong. The air felt thick, oppressive. The whispers were louder now, but she couldn't make out the words. They seemed to swirl around her, growing louder with each passing second. She glanced toward the bed and gasped. There, lying on the bed, was the figure of a woman. At first, Lily thought it might be her grandmother, but the woman was pale, her skin unnaturally so, and her hair was long and dark, spilling out across the pillow like a river of ink. The woman's eyes were closed, but there was something wrong with her. She looked different, not quite right. Lily stepped back, her heart racing. "Grandma?" she whispered, but the figure didn't move. It didn't respond. And then, without warning, the door slammed shut behind her. Lily screamed, spinning around. The room was now dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the snow outside. She ran toward the door, throwing herself against it, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if something or someone was closing in on her. She turned, her eyes wide with panic, but the figure on the bed was gone, and in its place stood something else. A tall, shadowy figure dressed in dark, tattered clothes. Its face was hidden in shadow, but Lily could feel its eyes on her, piercing through her, filling her with a deep, primal fear. "You shouldn't have come," the figure whispered, its voice low and cold. Lily turned and ran, not caring where she went, just needing to escape. She didn't stop until she was outside, gasping for breath in the biting cold, the snow swirling around her like a blinding storm. The farmhouse stood behind her, silent, still, as though nothing had happened. But Lily knew the truth. The house wasn't empty. It never had been. Story the end.
Story number 9.
It had been a long day, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped sharply. Rebecca wrapped her scarf tightly around her neck and pushed through the thick snowdrifts. She had always loved the winter, but tonight was different. The kind of cold that bites at your bones, creeping into your skin, made her uneasy. The small, rustic cabin she had rented was a welcome sight after the 2-hour drive up the mountain. She was alone, by choice, to escape the pressures of city life. There was no one to talk to, no one to distract her. Just her, the cold, and the ever-encroaching darkness that the winter brought. She had found the cabin online, advertised as a perfect winter retreat for solitude and relaxation. The description had sounded ideal: secluded, with a fireplace, stunning views, and, best of all, absolute silence. The kind of silence that Rebecca desperately needed. The cabin was old, built in the 1920s, with exposed wooden beams and a stone fireplace that seemed to command attention. The cold air smelled fresh, with hints of pine and snow, and inside, the warmth of the fire crackled invitingly. Rebecca set her bags down near the fireplace and walked over to the window. The snowstorm that had started earlier in the day was intensifying, the snowflakes swirling in the harsh wind. She pulled the curtains shut and turned her attention back to the fire, hoping to settle in with a good book and a warm drink. But there was something else that caught her attention. It was a faint sound, a scratching noise, like something moving across the floor above her. At first, she thought it was the house settling. Old houses tend to make strange noises, especially in the winter when the wood expands and contracts. But the sound persisted, rhythmic and deliberate. Rebecca paused. She tried to shake it off, telling herself it was nothing. The wind outside howled louder, and the storm intensified, rattling the windows. But the scratching grew louder, closer. It seemed to be coming from the attic, directly above the living room. With a nervous laugh, she stood up, brushing the stray thoughts from her mind. "Just the house," she muttered under her breath. She grabbed her phone to check the time, nearly 8 p.m. She should have been tired from the long drive, but her nerves kept her on edge. The snowstorm outside, the isolation of the cabin, and now the strange sound above her, all of it combined into a growing unease that settled heavily in her chest. She decided to investigate. Rebecca climbed the creaky stairs and opened the door to the attic. The stairs leading up were narrow, dark, and steep, but she knew she had to check. The last thing she needed was to imagine something haunting her all night. As she reached the top, the air was frigid, colder than the rest of the house. She reached for the light switch, but it was broken, nothing more than a dusty, old wire hanging from the ceiling. She used the flashlight on her phone to illuminate the attic, revealing its sparse contents: boxes of old holiday decorations, piles of forgotten furniture, and old dusty bookshelves. The scratching sound had stopped, but the tension in the air remained, thick and palpable. She stepped further into the attic, carefully avoiding piles of old belongings. She was beginning to think it was just the wind or the settling of the house. Then she saw it. At the far corner of the attic, where the roof sloped down, was a small door. It was half open, as though someone had left it ajar recently. The door itself was strange, a weathered wooden thing that looked out of place against the otherwise mundane surroundings. A chill ran down her spine. Rebecca hesitated for a moment before walking toward it. Her heart beat faster with every step. When she reached the door, she pushed it open, revealing a narrow, dimly lit room, its floor covered in thick dust. Inside, the air smelled of mildew, and there was something else, something faint, but unsettling, as if it had been closed off for years, untouched, until now. The room was empty, save for a small, unremarkable chair placed in the center. But as Rebecca stepped inside, she felt the weight of something unseen press against her. She turned to leave, but then she saw it, a series of scratch marks on the far wall, deep gouges, some of which had been covered in what looked like old, peeling paint. The marks were uneven, jagged, like someone or something had been trying to escape. Her pulse quickened. Rebecca backed out of the room, shutting the door behind her with a shaky hand. Something in the air had changed. The feeling of dread that had settled over her intensified. She quickly descended the stairs, but the scratching noise started up again, louder now, as if following her. Frantically, she checked the windows, hoping for some sign that she wasn't alone. But there was nothing, just the blinding snowstorm outside, swirling in chaotic patterns. Her breath caught in her throat as the noise grew louder still, now joined by a faint whisper, like a voice calling from the walls. "Get out!" Rebecca's skin prickled. She dropped her phone in fear, the light flickering as it hit the floor. The room seemed to grow darker, the air colder. Her eyes darted around the cabin, the sense that something was closing in on her, almost unbearable. She rushed to the front door, only to find it frozen shut by a thick layer of ice. Panicking, she turned back toward the fireplace, searching for anything to help her escape. But the room was no longer the cozy retreat she had first arrived in. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched unnaturally long, and the fire in the hearth flickered violently before dying out completely. The room was plunged into darkness. Suddenly, the door to the attic creaked open again. Rebecca didn't wait to see what was on the other side. She screamed as she threw her weight against the front door, finally forcing it open. The storm outside was deafening, the wind biting into her exposed skin as she ran blindly into the snow. The cabin loomed behind her, dark and foreboding. As she sprinted toward the edge of the property, she glanced back one last time. In the attic window, she saw a figure, pale and gaunt, its eyes hollow, staring out at her from the darkness. It stood perfectly still, as if watching her leave. Rebecca never went back to that cabin. The storm raged for hours, and by the time she reached the nearby village, she was trembling uncontrollably. She stayed there that night, unable to shake the image of the figure in the window. The locals told her stories of the cabin, how it had once belonged to an old man who had died alone, his body found in the attic, his fingers still bloodied from scratching at the walls. They said the place was haunted. Rebecca didn't need to hear the rest. She knew. Story the end.